Hi guys, welcome to practical session number 5. Today we're going to be building some database stored procedures using the PL/PGSQL procedural function language in Postgres. So we're going to be looking at the content from chapter 13 in the text today. There's only a little section in chapter 13 that actually covers the PL/PGSQL stuff, but we'll go through it here. And the idea of this practical session is just to give you a really quick intro into this scripting language, so we can go through and we'll create some functions and see how they can be called. So just going to start off today with a little bit of housekeeping stuff. In today's practical session, we'll be working with Postgres as usual, but we'll be using the Booktown database. Now, the Booktown database should be familiar to you from your practical assignment that you should be starting on about now. So it's available from the Prac 2 page there. So just go through and download that file to your Turing account from the URL here that we've got listed. Today you don't need to use your app's user account because we're just working through the PSQL client application. So go through and create your Prac 5 database. So do a create DB and then log in to your database, and you can actually go and run the P1 Booktown SQL script from within your Prac 5 database, and you should create some tables. So you should see a table list like I've got here on the left hand side on my terminal there. So go through and create that one so that you've got the Booktown database available for you to work through today's Prac. So in the previous lab session, we actually looked at connecting up some custom developed Java applications to the Postgres database management system to build some data-driven applications. So in this approach, we actually embedded SQL statements within the Java general purpose programming language. But for some applications, it may actually make more sense to do the vast majority of the processing within the database management system. So last week, all we were doing is pretty much getting data out, doing some processing, putting data back in. Now, sometimes we don't want to actually we don't want to create extra traffic. We don't want additional queries to actually be carried out. So it makes sense to actually have stored procedures within the database management system that are actually able to carry out some of the processing for us. So basically, this is provided by the PL/PGSQL language here. Now, the idea is that you can group computation and series of queries inside these functions, and essentially it introduces the power of a procedural language. So you can do computations, you've got selection and iteration on the database records, and you can use all sorts of mathematical functions and character processing, anything you'd normally see inside a general purpose process programming language within this procedural language. So the idea of this is that we get considerable savings in the client-server communication overhead. So we avoid extra round trips between the client and server. So instead of actually having the server send data out, doing some processing on it, send it back, get more data, we actually just do all of the processing. We just trigger off the process on the server, and it just sends the result back. Intermediate results the client doesn't need to have can be marshaled or transferred between the server and the client. So all of the calculations are done on the database management system, and multiple rounds of query passing are avoided, and you can increase the performance there. So remember that every time a query is executed, it has to be passed, it has to be processed into an internal representation, and that process actually attracts a certain amount of overhead, where if we can just have a single function call that results in multiple queries being executed on the server side, we don't need to actually pass each individual query as if it's being executed by the general purpose program. So PL/PGSQL can be used to create custom functions that can be called within the database that use the procedural control structures such as loops, selection, so if then else statements, similar to what we'd see in other high-level programming languages. So now we're actually going to kick into our PL/PGSQL basics, and we're going to look at creating our first function. So the procedures in PL/PGSQL are defined using DDL statements in the same way that we do for our tables and our views. So basically we have our create function clause here, and we drop in a name, a parameter list, a return type, and then we declare any variables that we're going to use in our function. Then we have our begin and end statements, so all of our statements that our function is going to execute get dropped in here, and then we end with this little section here indicating that everything between those dollar signs, the double dollar sign tokens, are in the PLPGSQL language there. So this just tells the database management system that this particular language here is different from the standard SQL language here. Now that may seem a little bit confusing there, so we'll just jump straight to our hello world example here. So here we can see we've used our create function statement, and we've created a function called hello. It doesn't take any parameters, so our parameter list is empty, and it's going to return a varchar type variable there. So then we've got our opening dollar signs, closing dollar signs down the bottom there. Then we've got our begin statement. In this situation, we're not declaring any variables because we're not using any variables in our processing. So basically, we're just returning the string hello world. Now, you can actually call that function just using a normal select statement. So if we just do a select statement here, we'll get our hello world returned there. So we're just got to go and create that one quickly. Created our function. Oop, got a tab in there somewhere. Go. No, it's already created, sorry. Right, so that's in there, and we can go and run our hello function there. So you can see there that we run our hello function using just the select statement, so it's just going to return a single column with the result of our hello function in there. So now we're just going to move on to another example here. This is very similar to our hello world example, but here we're actually declaring some variables that we're going to use. So again, we have our create function clause here. We're actually creating a function called add function, so it just adds these values together and adds the first two values that we declare here together and stores it in the third value for return. But again, we specify our name, which is add function. We're returning an integer type this time. Then we have our declare block. So in our declare block, we're creating three variables, so value 1, 2, and 3, and they're all integer type. So notice that the syntax here differs from most programming languages because the type is specified after the actual identifier there. So make sure you get that one around the right way. We're actually assigning some values to these variables as well. So you can see that the assignment operator in PLPGSQL is actually the colon equals operator here, the colon equals token. So it's not just the simple equals operation. So remember, just the equals alone is used for logical comparison. So if you're comparing for equality between two values, you just use a single equal statement. If you're assigning a value, you use the colon equal statement there. And we can see in our begin end block here, we've got our values. We actually change we assign a new value to each of our values, and we go through and actually process them there, and we add those two values together, and then we return the result there. So if we go through here, we should be able to actually create that function, drop that one in, created our function, so that's indicated by the create function return there, and we can actually go and run our function here by triggering it off with a select call there. So you can see we've got our result, which is our 10 plus 5, as we'd expect there. So we're going to actually go to the next step now and actually pass in some parameters. So here we've got another function called sum of two numbers, and it actually accepts two parameters. So we've specified a parameter list here, m and n. They're both integers, they're comma separated, and again we have the type after the actual identifier, so that's slightly different to other programming languages. We're returning an integer, and then we're specifying that in our begin end block that we're actually just returning m plus n. So I actually have that one in here. I have sum of two numbers already in there, so if I do a call to sum of two numbers, So I'll just grab this one from down here to demonstrate. I've already created this function in my database, so I should just be able to call it there. And you can see that it's returned the sum of those two functions. If I update that one, you see we get a different value returned there. So you can see there that we can actually create some we can use all of these building blocks to build quite a rich set of functions there. PGSQL procedures can execute queries and manipulate the data in the database as well. So the following function returns the full name of an author by the author ID. A variable of a composite type is called a row. So we're actually using this composite type variable, this row type variable, to store the rows from our select query. So you can see here that we're just returning we've got our function. So again, we've used a create function line there. It's returning an integer. Sorry, it's not returning an integer, it's returning a text field. It takes a single integer as a parameter. Now you can see here we haven't given this parameter a name, and we're actually referring to that parameter using the $1 symbol there. So these $1, $2, $3 are all the parameters that are listed in this list if they aren't explicitly identified with identifiers like we saw in the previous example here. So here we had the M and N actually identifying them. Here we don't have any identifiers, so they're given an automatic identifier for us. Here we have our begin block, so we're selecting into our found author variable. So remember, our found author variable is a row type for our author, and then we're actually returning the first name and last name concatenated together with a space. So the string concatenation operator in SQL or in PostgreSQL is actually the double pipe there, so we can concatenate our strings together to create to return rich strings there. So let's do a quick check here, and I'll see if I've got that one actually in there. So we want get author. I've already got get author in there. So if I go and run our example here, you can see that I'll return the details for author with the ID number 16 there. So we can see there that we've actually just selected a single row of data. So remember our query here, our select query, where we're selecting into found author, which is our row type. This is our author's row type variable. We're selecting a single author in because we're identifying it by the primary key. So there's only ever going to be one author with a particular ID, so we don't have to worry about multiple authors being returned, trying to pack multiple things into our found author or our row type, found author row type variable here. So we can see that we get the name returned as expected. Here we have a slightly more complex example in which we actually search for a specific author by name and throw an exception if the author is not returned. So you can see here we've actually got a function, we've called it test1 to be descriptive, and we've got this parameter here called first name, and it's a text parameter going in, and it returns a text value, so it actually returns either OK or it doesn't return anything at all. So if we go through and run this one, actually I'll just check that whether we do have that one in there. We have, what's it called, test1. We actually have test1 already in there, so we should just be able to go. And we're going to put in so you can see that particular author was in there. So we've got Stephen King listed in our authors table. If we misspell his name though, it actually throws an error out. That's because we're raising an exception. So we've got seeing this syntax here, we're packing it into our found author. If nothing is returned, so if not found, our not found operation here will be true if there's nothing actually selected into our found author. So if this particular query returns no rows, then this will be true, and then we'll actually use this to actually raise an exception there. So just a really quick example there where you can actually raise errors and manage them manually there. So up until now, we haven't really looked at anything particularly complex. We've just been basically printing some stuff back out. But now we're going to move on and have a look at some of the control structures that are actually offered by PGSQL. So it provides basically selection and iteration. So selection is provided through the use of the if then else or else and else if operators, and also the case operations. So you've probably seen these in C. They're actually the switch, similar to the switch operation. We then have the loops as well. But we'll go through and have a look at our selection operation. So the following example uses an if then else statement to determine if the current date is the first day of the month. So you can see here that we've actually created a function called day1. We put in, it accepts a parameter called current date. That doesn't necessarily literally have to be the current date, it's just any date value you can pass in there. Then it actually uses this extract function here to return the day from that current date. If it equals 1, if the day equals 1, then we know it's the first day of the month. Otherwise, it's not the first day of the month. We can see here I've actually passed in, I've used a current underscore date value here. So if we do something like select so you see here the current underscore date identifier is actually basically an identifier that's provided by the Postgres database server that returns the current date. So today's the 7th of the 8th, 2015, so it's returned that value. So if we pass that one in, you can see that that one obviously isn't going to be the first day. If we pass this particular date in here though, where we specify it's the 1st of the 1st, you can see there that it's actually the first day of the month there, and that's because it's executed the first branch of our loop here. Notice that we've used the equals operator here. So remember, the equals operator standing alone is the equality test operator. So remember, to assign values, we have to use the colon equals operator. So it's slightly different there to other programming languages. We can actually use the case operator here to specify, basically provides a test for equality or the presence of items in lists. So you can see here we've got our case and end case statements to wrap around, and then we have our when clauses. So when x, and we have in operator. So we're testing if x is present in a particular list of values here. So we're actually returning, basically determining if it's a particular number between 0 or between 1 and 11 is actually an odd or even number. So let me check if I've got that one created already. I've got odd or even. So if I go select odd or even, put 1 into there. Oop, I'm missing, we've got an error coming in there. Because it's not listed, sorry about that one. So if we do that one, we've got an even number. We don't have a default case in there, so your number has to be in one of these, within these lists, otherwise you'll get an error thrown out there because we don't have a catch-all clause there. So basically we're selecting a particular case based upon, in this particular situation, whether this variable, which is our parameter, is actually present in our list of values. You can replace that with an equality statement there as well. So a nice little example there to get you kicked off. So now we're moving on. So we've looked at selection, our basic selection statements, our selection structures. Now we're looking at our loops. So there's a couple of ways that we can loop through. We can either use the loop keyword that creates basically a never-ending loop that we have to break out of when some condition is met. So that's kind of like a post condition loop there. And then we have our while loop here, so our precondition loop, where while ever a condition is met, it loops around. And we also have a for loop that allows us to actually iterate through items in a list, and we've got some examples here to look through with those. So the first one we're going to look at is our loop statement. Here we're actually, here in this particular example, the loop iterates until the cube of the parameter is equal to or greater than 10,000. So we can see here that we've created a function called myCube, and it takes a single integer as its parameter. We then go through and we alias that integer, so we're going to call that an integer nm. and we've declared another integer called cube. And then we assign, so we say cube is, we initially assign nm to cube, and then we loop through, and each iteration of the loop we're multiplying cube by itself 3 times, and we've got this exit when cube is greater than or equal to or greater than 10,000. So you can see it's a post condition loop there. So it's always going to basically go through the first part of the loop before breaking out on that condition. Now, so when we run that one, if we pass in 3, we'll get the answer of 19,683. It's important that we correctly determine our exit condition, otherwise that loop will go forever. If we don't get this exit condition correct, we won't break out. Usually, the while and for loop are more useful structures, simply because they have the check before we go into the loop, and the for loop is there to iterate through a block of returned items. So here we're using the for loop. So the for loop has the condition beforehand. So we have the keyword while, we have our condition loop, and we have our end loop to complete the block. And we line up our statements within the block there that we want to execute. So again, we're re-implementing our cube function here. And instead of using the loop syntax, we're using the while syntax, the while loop, and again we're just checking here if the cube value is less than 10,000. Otherwise, we're iterating through and cubing that each time. So the final little section that we're going to look at today, introduce today rather, is the for loop. So the for loop can actually be used to actually iterate through a list of items. So it's similar to some of the for loops that are provided in other languages. So C#, for example, and offers a system to actually iterate through a list of items. Same with Python. This is similar again here because we can iterate through our list, which is specified by this expression here, and we've got our statements lined up within our loop block. And here we have an example where we're grabbing author names. So here we're outputting, we're basically concatenating all of the author's names into a single output variable. And essentially we're not taking any parameters, we're returning a text type value. We're initializing an output a value called output text with a new line character, and we're creating a row data type variable called row data, author row type variable called row data. Basically, we're going through and using this select statement, we're grabbing all of our authors, ordering by first name, and each of those rows will be assigned for each row that we're assigning to our row data here. We're going through and we're concatenating the first and last name from that record into the output text. So a little bit of tricky syntax there. So go through and digest that one and make sure that you go and run that one. I'll let you run that one yourself. I'll probably do a really quick demo here. The output won't be nicely formatted because we're just concatenating everything together. So you can see that you get a big long list of author names that are being produced for us. So it's quite an ugly output there. So that sort of that introduces our quick tour of the PGSQL scripting language. So now I've got a couple of exercises for you. They're kind of fill in the blanks type exercises. So for you to work through, there's only 2 of them. The first one here, we're constructing a function called extract title that takes a single integer type parameter containing the subject ID and returns a string that contains a comma separated list. So it's a comma separated list of all the titles of the books that correspond to that subject. So recall that in our Booktown database, we have a subject. So we have first of all we have our books table. So we select from our books table. We can see here that the books actually have they have a title, a book ID, an author ID, and a subject ID. If we select from our subject table, select from our subjects table, you can see there that we've got a whole list of subjects. So if we specify a particular subject ID, we want to get a list of a comma separated list of all of the book titles that correspond to that particular subject ID. So you can go and create a loop there. So you've got a couple of lines to fill in. The first one, you've got to create a variable to store your text output, and then you've got to actually go through and do the string concatenation operation. I've already given you the query there and the structure of the for loop. Just got to fill that little section in there. Second exercise is a little bit more in depth. You'll be creating a function called inStock that accepts 2 integer parameters that contain a book ID and an edition for that particular book, and the function will actually return a true/false value indicating if the book is in stock. So there's a few queries that you've got to fix up here. So I've given you descriptions of those queries, and you've got some bits there that you've got to edit there. So there's only actually 3 little sections that you've got to change there. So go through and implement those two functions, just so that you can just to solidify your understanding of your PL/PGSQL scripting. So that's all we have for today, guys. Thanks.